Senator Bernie Sanders has unveiled a plan aimed at ending corporate greed and corruption. His campaign released details of this proposal this morning. It mandates that corporations pay their fair share of taxes, give workers an ownership stake, and it breaks up monopolies.
So this is the second policy platform released by the Sanders campaign since the presidential hopeful was hospitalized following a heart attack. Joining us to expand on the new platform and how a Sanders administration would accomplish it is National Policy Director and Senior Advisor for the Bernie Sanders campaign, Josh Orton. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so in your view, what are sort of this? There's a lot in this plan.
There's a lot.
What do you see as the most significant pieces here?
Well, I think we have to start from the premise, which I think we all agree with, is that this is an unprecedented moment in American history of corporate power, and not just the fact that they've consolidated wealth and income, but they've also consolidated control.
That's right.
Over the government, over the regulatory system, and over workers, right? And so I think when we start from that premise, you have to look at all the different levers that corporate America has used, essentially, to rig the system for themselves and against workers. And so we looked at it in terms of three distinct areas. One, we looked at making sure that corporations pay their fair share in taxes and stop this business of keeping revenue overseas and in shelters, right? You saw major corporations like Amazon, as Bernie talks about quite frequently, paid effectively no taxes year over year, right?
Right.
Second, we looked at the idea that the FTC basically the Federal Trade Commission has essentially failed in its mission in making sure that companies don't monopolize different sectors. They don't grow stronger and stronger. We're seeing, this long tradition of a strong antitrust sentiment in America, where we're going to keep corporate power on a fairly short leash, both to empower workers and small business people. We've seen that degrade over decades and decades and decades.
Yeah.
And then the third area, I think, is what Bernie, I think, has talked about as the most radical, which is looking at democratizing corporations and giving workers ownership and control. And that means giving them up to 45% of the board seats directly at corporations that are at $100 million or more, but also giving workers up to 20% of an ownership stake in the corporations. And we see this not just as good for the workers, but good as a sustainable tool for communities and for the corporations themselves.
Let's talk about this on a practical level. How do you actually plan to execute on that? So what would it say? A mandate that any corporation that's created in the United States has to have a 20% worker board. Now, what do those workers look like? Are they represented, and voted by amongst their own people? And same with the boards. How does this actually play about under this plan? Yeah,
what basically happens is the corporations need to buy at least 2% every year, give workers ownerships up to the maximum of 20%.
Okay.
And when it comes to the boards, what you're going to see is basically an apparatus that lets the workers elect their own board representatives, so that these are not chosen by management. These are not chosen by as the corporate board's favorite worker representatives. These are actually democratically elected by the people who work at the corporations themselves, right? And one of the ways you've seen corporations hoard their own power and their own decision making is by keeping workers completely out of the corporate boardroom. You saw Bernie earlier this year go down to Arkansas on behalf of the workers of Walmart to advocate for something like this. And you see this as a grassroots movement across the country, not just at huge corporations like Walmart, but in a lot of major corporations, and this would apply to all publicly held corporations as well.
Yeah, I mean, what I talked about this morning in my monologue is basically wealth is power, right?
That's right.
As long as you have a group of people who are owners and a group of people who are wage earners, you're going to continue to have the spiraling inequality.
That's right.
You're going to continue to have the political corruption that we see in this system and things growing further and further apart. And the politics, frankly, getting wonkier and wonkier as well. Is there any precedent for this type of plan either here in the U.S. or in countries abroad? Yeah,
sure. So there's a couple of proposals in Europe that look somewhat like this. You see the corporate board representation in a country like Germany, although they have a different sort of apparatus for corporate boards, so we're not quite where they are just because of the nature of the system. But you're also seeing the worker ownership movement gain a lot of steam in the UK, right, where it's the same idea that workers have long been shut out of the process, not just in control, but in actually benefiting from their own labor. And I think that there's one other point that's interesting as we look at issues like climate change, and we see we have less than 12 years in order to make drastic changes to reverse what is likely to be irreversible damage, right? If the people who work at corporations not only have control over some direction of the corporation's decision making, but actually an ownership stake in the company where they work, they're a lot less likely to ship jobs overseas. But when it comes to climate change, they're going to be a lot less likely to pollute the communities in which the corporations operate.
So Josh, I hate to go all George Will here, but I mean, how do you create a dynamic economy that is agile and able to actually innovate like this? Because the examples that you've given us, Germany, a lot of these are not countries which are going to have major say in the affairs of the world vis-a-vis China and global market competition, or create massive $100 billion companies. This seems to me something that could condemn the United States to stagnation more than anything else, because 45% of the workers on these boards are never going to want to make a game-changing decision. And again, I am somebody who advocates so much more for corporate power. But what is the balance of the actual dynamism that is needed to keep America the preeminent world power?
Sure. Well, I think what's interesting is the problem that you're concerned about is actually the one we're facing right now, which is that corporations have largely, and this comes up with the terrible trade agreements that Bernie has voted against consistently throughout his corporate life too, or through his public life too, right? Which is that corporations are not just taking control within the U.S. government, but they're actually trying to control their own ecosystem internationally. And so I think what you have is corporations who are affecting a race to the bottom in regulations, in worker protections, in environmental standards. So I think the exact opposite is true. I think that under this plan, corporations are a lot more likely to make sustainable, innovative decisions internationally to actually protect and grow the middle-class communities where they're based. And I think that this notion that somehow that the United States doesn't have the sort of innovative instinct or the will or the daring almost to compete internationally when workers have more control is a talking point we've heard from sort of the elected officials who've been bought out by corporations for many years.
Well, there's this view that, only the corporate execs could possibly know what to do.
The sort of masters of the universe kind of idea. Which
is, I think, condescending and completely contrary to the fact that their short-term profit maximization is exactly what's destroying the planet, the country, et cetera, et cetera. Let me ask you, though, Senator Sanders was on the Sunday shows this weekend, and for the first time ever really made a sort of direct contrast with his opponent, Senator Elizabeth Warren. Let's take a listen to that.
Every American is going to make his or her own choice about the candidate that they want. And Elizabeth Warren has been a friend of mine for some 25 years, and I think she is a very, very good senator. But there are differences between Elizabeth and myself. Elizabeth, I think, as you know, has said that she is a capitalist through her bones. I'm not. I am, I believe, the only candidate who's going to say to the ruling class of this country, the corporate elite, enough with your greed and with your corruption. We need real change in this country.
Josh, why is he making this distinction at this moment, and do we expect to hear more of that at the debate tomorrow? Well,
I think that Bernie's been working on these particular issues his entire adult life, right? Even back when he was mayor of Burlington, Vermont, he was having community discussions about worker ownership, right? Bernie has, I think, most precisely diagnosed the problem of corporate power. I think that what we see here is a complete autopsy of all the ways that corporations, through legislation, through taxes, through buying out the legislative process and the political process, have really taken over all of the levers of power and pulled every single one of them to make themselves more powerful. I think that's a diagnosis and how it's crushed middle income families that Bernie's been making for a generation. And I think what you're seeing now is a very comprehensive plan to address every specific part and every way that corporations have essentially been motivated by their own greed to hold on to wealth and power. And so, look, I think this is actually quite a consistent plan that just matches the kind of diagnosis that Bernie's been making for a generation.
How does it contrast with what Warren's put out there?
Well, of course, I'll let Elizabeth Warren talk about her own plans and her own campaign. But I think when you look at some of the main points here in Bernie's plan, it really has to do with, are workers going to have enough control, not just and enough ownership, not just in the very largest 2 or 3 or 5 corporations, but in every corporation that has a balance sheet above $100 million or is publicly owned. And I think that proposal you may call it radical, but I think it's actually in direct proportion with the corporate greed that we're seeing today.
Yeah, I mean, from my analysis, I generally see it the same way, which is Elizabeth Warren's much more concentrates on the highest concentrated places of corporate power, but not necessarily throughout the whole economy. And this is much more of a restructuring, if you will. But thank you so much for joining us, Josh.
On the
We really
rollout.
appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Josh.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Next on Rising, Senator Sanders' recent heart attack may have ignited discussions in the punditry class about his recent setback as a vulnerability.
But The Hill's Max Greenwood explains why some in the Sanders camp view it as an opportunity for the senator to connect with the voters on a human level when Rising returns.